Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Antonucci. I'm a New Hampshire Peace Action board member, and I'm really happy to welcome you to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation Series online on January 30th, 2023. A very quick reminder on Zoom etiquette. We love it when you keep your video on, but do ask that you keep your audio muted and use the chat to ask questions for now. Later, there will likely be opportunity for hand raising and talking, but for now, it would be great if you use the chat. New Hampshire Peace Action is entering our 41st year of educating, mobilizing, and organizing to build a more peaceful and just future for all, based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. In that spirit of respect, we'd like to acknowledge that we are doing our work on Nidakina, the traditional ancestral homelands of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki people. We honor with gratitude the land, the waterways, and the people who have stewarded Nidakina throughout the generations. So we started this series to help us stay connected during the pandemic and have found it so much fun and so useful that we're going to keep it going. And tonight is a great, really illustrates part of what we love about it, that we can bring someone from on the other coast here to spend the evening with us. We're so excited to welcome David Hartsough, who has been an activist for more than 60 years. He was a longtime employee of the American Friends Service Committee. He co-founded the Nonviolent Peace Force and World Beyond War, and served for many years as the director of Peace Workers. He's organized peace efforts in the Soviet Union, Nicaragua, the Philippines, and Kosovo, to name a few. His first arrest was actually in 1960 for taking part in the civil rights sit-ins in Maryland and Virginia with other students, where they successfully integrated the lunch counters in Arlington, Virginia. Since then, he's been arrested for nonviolent civil disobedience more than 150 times. He wrote a wonderful book about his life and his experiences, and tonight he's going to bring us a little bit from this long journey he's had. And then we're going to have a chance to ask him some questions. So please join me. Let's have a very visible welcome for David. And I hand it to you, David.
Thank you, Amy, and thanks to all of you for being here this evening, and also for your lifelong work for a more peaceful and just world. We need all of us, and it sounds like this series is really helpful in strengthening your own sense of community and vision of what could be, and keeping at it. Well, in the last century, 200 million people died in wars. And it seems like we're continuing on the same path. Maybe we'll even do better than that if we have a nuclear war. Better in the meaning even more people could die. We hear about mass shootings almost every day. The economic injustice, where the rich seem to be getting richer and the poor getting poorer. I mean, it can seem overwhelming. And I think that one of the things that's most needed is hope. That we can really make a difference, and we can create a world in which people could live together, in peace and in justice, and with justice, not in this dog eat dog. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys, whoever it is. And spending over half our discretionary budget on killing people and preparing for wars and nuclear wars, et cetera. I wrote this book, Waging Peace, because I think a lot of people have kind of given up hope that we can make a difference. And I want to share some of the stories from my own life that might encourage people and inspire people that, wow, we can make a difference. So I'm going to show some slides and share some stories for about half an hour, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion. So I look forward to that. That's me. Two policemen are protecting me. Not really. They're taking me to jail. Next. So this is in 1958, when the United States and the Soviet Union were testing nuclear weapons on almost a weekly basis. And the Golden Rule, a small boat, 4 Quakers actually decided to sail out into the test area in the Pacific to try to essentially saying, over our dead bodies, this has to stop. So in Philadelphia on our spring vacation, when I was in high school, and that's me with the Walk for Peace sign, walked from Philadelphia to the United Nations. I was living near Philadelphia at that time, calling on all nations to stop their nuclear weapons testing. And it was about that time that the FBI started my FBI files. Next. So this is the lunch counter in Virginia that was mentioned earlier. Everything, all the eating facilities in Maryland and Virginia were segregated back in 1960, early 1960. And when the 4 students in Greensboro, North Carolina, African-American students, decided we can't take this anymore and went to a Woolworth's drugstore to get something to eat, they were arrested. And that kind of sent a signal to especially African-American students all over the South to say, we can't take it either. So sit-ins happened all over the South. At Howard University, where I was a student, we, together with African-American friends, we would go to lunch counters in Maryland almost every Saturday. And instead of giving us something to eat, they would call the police and the police would arrest us. And we would spend the weekend in jail singing freedom songs. Well, the state of Virginia had passed a law saying anybody that challenged segregation in Virginia could get 6 months in jail and $500 fines. So for most of that spring, we kept going to Maryland. But in June, after our final exams, the American Nazi Party, which was headquartered in Virginia, was threatening violence to anybody that challenged segregation there. And nobody else had challenged the segregation in the eating facilities. So we did some additional nonviolence training and went down to Arlington, Virginia to a so-called People's Drugstore. And here we are, I'm on the far end. And it's the owner didn't want the publicity. So he was not going to serve us anything, but he also decided not to arrest us because he didn't want the publicity. So we actually sat there for 2 days waiting for something to eat. And people spit in our faces. People put lit cigarettes down our shirts. People punched us. So we would fall on the floor and then they would kick us. Each time that this happened, we tried to respond in a nonviolent, loving way, which was the discipline for the people that were in the sit-in movement. Well, toward the end of the second day, a fellow came up from behind me, and I'd been reading the New Testament, love your enemies, and do good to those who hate you. And he yelled out, he says, "You get out of this store in 2 seconds or I'm going to stab this through your heart." And I looked around at his terrible look of hatred in his face, and in his hand was a switchblade, which was maybe an inch from my heart. And I felt, no, I have 2 seconds to decide, do I really believe in nonviolence, or is there a different way to do this, to deal with this guy? And we'd had a lot of practice, and I just tried to smile at this guy, looked him in the face, and I said, "Friend, do what you believe is right, but I'll still try to love you." And it was miraculous. This guy who was filled with hatred, his jaw began to drop and his hand began to fall with a knife, and he left the store. And for a young 20-year-old, that was kind of an amazing experience. Well, there were 500 people outside because it had been the front page of the paper, threatening violence to us. And we read a statement appealing to the religious and community and business leaders to get the eating facilities open to everyone. And then this was the hard part. We said, if nothing changes, we'll be back in a week. Well, some friendly media people got us out alive and back to Washington. And at Howard, we literally shook for 6 days whether we had the courage to go back and do this again. And on the 6th day, we got a phone call that the religious and community leaders had met and had talked with the business leaders and had got a commitment to open the eating facilities in Arlington to everyone within 10 days. Well, that was the most important experience of my life, that instead of sitting at home and crying about the news or cursing the television set or getting upset at the president or Congress or whatever, find some other people that believe as deeply as you do about something, get some nonviolent training, and go out and challenge it. And that's essentially what I've been trying to do the rest of my life. So that was a very important experience. Next. So that's just another picture at the lunch counter. I've got my little New Testament there that I was reading. Next. So instead of going to jail for 6 months, this was during the Berlin crisis, where the US and the Soviet Union were threatening nuclear war over Berlin. And I'd studied German in high school and decided I want to go to Berlin and try to understand, what is this whole thing about? Why are we threatening nuclear war over the city? So I spent my junior year in college at the 2 universities in East Berlin and West Berlin. And I would bicycle through Checkpoint Charlie each morning and to go to the university in East Berlin And these are American tanks on this side facing east, and those are Soviet tanks on the other side facing west. And I'd go to the classes and I'd hear a lot of communist propaganda. And when I challenged it, they called me a capitalist warmonger. And then I went back to the Free University in West Berlin and heard a lot of anti-communist propaganda. And I challenged some of that. And they called me a communist conspirator. What I learned was we, on both sides of the Iron Curtain at that time, is what we called it, between the Soviet Union and the United States, we have this black-white image of the world. They're the bad guys, we're the good guys. And we feed ourselves and our whole population's propaganda, in which we come to feel, well, these guys really aren't so terrible. We better risk nuclear war. So it just seemed to me then, and still seems to me, an insane way to try to get security. And this nationalism, which is such a sin, really, and is devouring us. Next. Well, from Berlin, I heard you could go camping in the Soviet Union. And I thought, wow. So I was able to, my folks sent me some money and I bought a VW Bug. And 5 of us, I traveled 6,000 miles through Russia or through the Soviet Union, just getting to know ordinary people. And as you see by these faces, the Russians were just caring, kind people who welcomed us into their homes and serving us, sharing the food that they had, etc. Well, that was the first of 3 trips in the 60s, in the early 60s that I led to the Soviet Union. Just people to people, getting to know each other, doing our little bit to try to break down these barriers, which our governments continue to do nuclear testing and threaten nuclear war. Next. Well, in the spring of 1962, I was arrested in front of the White House for praying for an end to our nuclear bomb testing, and spent some nights in jail. Later that summer, I was taking another trip to Russia. And like we had done in the United States, we talked with Russian people about the nuclear bomb tests. And it was interesting, the Americans all said, well, our bombs are just for peace and for defense. Go and talk with the Russians. And here we are in Red Square protesting against the Soviet bomb tests and giving out a flyer that was in Russian, which actually was from the San Francisco to Moscow Peace March, about why we're opposed to all nuclear bomb tests. And here the people are crowded around me saying, well, our bombs are just peaceful bombs. We lost 20 million people in the last war, or in the Second World War, and we don't want, we weren't prepared. So we've got to be prepared this time. Well, the police, the Soviet police came up, and when they find out what we're doing, threatened us with 20 years imprisonment if we didn't get out of the Red Square and stop this demonstration. Well, I said something to the effect, thank you for warning us, but if the United States and the Soviet Union continue their nuclear bomb testing and a nuclear arms race, we could all end up dead. And that would be worse than 20 years in prison. And I said, I was arrested just this spring in front of the White House protesting our bomb tests and spent time in jail there. Well, he said, I'm going to have to talk to my superiors. And the police left and they never came back. So we went back to our campsite that night. But unfortunately, for 26 years after that, I was not allowed to go back to the Soviet Union because they said my behavior in the Soviet Union was not, what did they say, was not acceptable for guests of the Soviet people. Next. Well, also that spring it was May 1st of 1962, 6 of us Quakers had a chance to meet with President Kennedy in the White House. And we spent about 35 minutes with him, appealing to him to both stop American nuclear bomb testing. That's the young guy, it's me there. But also to challenge the Russians to a peace race. You know, the arms race was getting us deeper and deeper into this morass. And Kennedy said, you know, I've been reading the Guns of August about before World War I, and everyone was arming to the teeth to try to make sure that they weren't going to have to go to war and to get security, defense. And he said it's scary how similar the situation was then to what it is now. It's 1962. And he says, if you really are serious about wanting me to take steps to really move us away from this arms race, you're going to have to become much more active, build a much more active movement to enable me to take those steps. When a secretary came in after 30 minutes and said, Mr. President, your next appointment is here, he said, tell them to wait. I'm learning something from these Quakers. So he had his job to do, and we had our job to do. And the last year of his life, he actually did what we asked him to do. And against the advice of all of his military advisors, over and over and over again. And Jim Douglas and many others feel that his taking those steps to try to move from total war footing to a more peaceful relationship with the rest of the world is part of what got him killed. Next. Well, this was during the Vietnam War, and Quakers began, or a bunch of us who happened to be Quakers, started reading the names of the war dead on the Capitol steps. And to try to call attention to, you know, all the Americans that were getting killed in this war. We would do this every Wednesday at noon, and we'd get arrested and go to jail. And that happened 3 successive Wednesdays. And I went to Congressman George Brown, who's the guy that's standing here from Southern California. And I said, you know, we're getting arrested just for reading the war dead names on the war dead on the Capitol steps. Anything you can do to help us? And he looked the typical politician, but he said, yeah, I think I'm going to join you. And furthermore, I'm going to invite every member of Congress to also join us. So the next day, when we were all arrested, the 3 members of Congress continued reading, I think it was the 35,000 names of the war dead at that time. That was George Brown and Ed Koch, who became the mayor New York, and Charles Diggs from Detroit. And many other members of Congress ended up joining us as well. So and within a couple of weeks, Life magazine had a picture and a brief story about every American soldier that died that month, which took up the whole magazine. And within weeks, there were demonstrations at federal buildings and military bases all over the country, people reading their names. And my belief is that our doing what we felt was right encouraged the Congress people to do what was right and got the attention of the national media. And that helped build the movement around the country. Next. Well, I'm going to have to go faster. This is my wife, Jan, and I, and our little baby, Heidi. And our 3-year-old son is right behind the police. Again, we were praying for an end to the war in Vietnam in front of the White House. And with 250 other Quakers. And the 250 other Quakers were all arrested, but for some reason they thought it was not a good idea media-wise to arrest this young couple. And so the chief of police spent 20 minutes trying to encourage us to leave. And he said, if you're arrested, your children are going to be taken away and put in juvenile hall. Don't you love your children? And we said, well, of course we love our children, but we also love the Vietnamese children. And anyway, this photo somehow caught the media attention and was in newspapers all across the country. And a lot of people, after they have children and are growing up, think, well, we have to give up those those idealistic ideas we had, but that we never caught that idea. Next. Well, this is 1962, June of 1962. And in December of 61, the US, did I say 61? I meant 71. In December in Christmas time, 1971, the US started bombing Hanoi and Haiphong. And well, I have to go faster here, but we lived in a community in West Philadelphia and got together and just tried to feel the horror of the families in Hanoi and Haiphong that were going to get killed. And then tried to look at what are we called to do to try to stop this. So we found 26 canoes and decided to go up to Norfolk, to Leonardo, New Jersey. And this is a ship, this happened to be called the USS Nitro, where we started literally putting our own bodies between the bombs and the people in Vietnam. And on the 7th morning, we were there after the ship had been loaded with napalm and anti-personnel bombs and everything else. And they were taking up anchor, and we paddled to try to be right in front of the ship. 7 of the sailors jumped off the ship and joined our blockade, to start swimming toward us to join our blockade. Well, that it was a photo in the New York Times, and it was on evening news. And that sparked people on both East and West Coast to start people's blockades, blocking ships going to Vietnam. And next slide, please. When we went down to Norfolk, Virginia, this aircraft carrier called the USS America was leaving for Vietnam, loaded with all the fighter jets and bombing planes. and I don't know, 1,000 sailors, however, I don't know how many. And they were cheering us, the sailors were cheering us on. But when they took up anchor, or actually the last hour before that ship left, 100 sailors went AWOL, left the ship. So again, I like to think that our courage gave courage to these sailors to do what they believed was right. And their courage gave courage to lots of other members of the military to begin opposing this war. And if you see the film Sir, No Sir, that's one of the reasons the war ended, is the soldiers were not obeying orders anymore. Next. Well, we were also, this is a ship from South Africa that was unloading, trying to unload cargo in San Francisco or Oakland. And the longshoremen decided not to cross our picket line. And so it was not able to unload in San Francisco. It went on to Portland, Oregon, where they had demonstrations that could not unload there, and then on to Seattle, and finally had to go back to South Africa. Next. Well, on the West Coast in Nevada, we have a nuclear test site, Nevada nuclear test site, where the US has tested all its bombs. And we, each year, people from all around the country, over the last, since 1982, have been going there and demonstrating with signs, and then crossing a line. And here's the line right in front of these people, and are usually arrested. Sometimes there's up to 1,000 of us there, who then spent weeks in jail. Next. Many of you have heard of Brian Wilson, but a Vietnam vet who, after his job, and he was with the Air Force, and after part of his job was to go into the villages after they'd been bombed to see how successful they'd been. And he went into this one village, and every village he went into was mostly women and children, old people. But here was a woman with her 2 children with their arms around their mother. And the mother is looking right at Brian, eyes wide open, and her eyelids had been burned off by napalm. She and her children were dead, but she was looking right at him. And it just, he had a conversion. Why am I 10,000 miles from home to try to, killing these people? And so he went to Nicaragua and saw the same thing happening again with the Contras. And he came back and said, David, we have to do something much more. So here we are at the beginning of Nuremberg actions, trying to uphold international law, the Nuremberg principles, blocking trains and trucks that are carrying munitions. Next. Brian, together with other veterans, said that starting September 1st of '87, they would be blocking every train. And the government had 3 choices. They could stop shipping ammunition and bombs to Central America, which they're taking, the trains would take them out to load onto ships. Or they could arrest them. And if they were arrested, they should know that as soon as they're out of jail, they'll come back. Or they could run over them. And we never had any idea that they might just run over them. So Brian got run over and lost 2 of his legs. And here, that's me trying to hold the blood in his head. He had a great big hole in his head. Well, luckily he survived. and the military was trying to say to us, we have a war to fight. You've got to get out of the way. But instead of getting out of the way, we actually blocked every train for 2.5 years that was carrying munitions out to load onto the ships for Central America. So I think that's kind of, and Brian, by the way, is living in Nicaragua now. He just got so discouraged about the US government's wars in different parts of the world. Well, I think that's probably time that we should open up for discussion. There's a lot more stories I could tell, but the last one, I'll just skip through to the last photo. Well, I'll just tell the story. But my mother was a school teacher and went to Fort Detrick, which was making germ warfare. And that's Mel Duncan and I who started the Nonviolent Peace Force. Next, or go on to the last one. But at any rate, so she, well, I guess I can't tell the story. We don't need to get into questions and discussion. That's Iran, where we're doing similar, instead of considering ourselves enemies, let's try to build people power from the bottom up. And I like to think, I agree with what Eisenhower, former President Eisenhower said. He said, I'd like to believe that the people of the world want peace so much that governments will have to get out of the way and let them have it. And I think that's needed right now. And so, this is my mom in the middle in the white, but she would spend the summers down there just in silence outside this germ warfare plant and calling for a conversion into health facilities. And 10 years later, she and my dad moved to Oregon. She was in a bookstore. And one day, a guy came up to her and said, were you part of that vigil at Fort Detrick 10 years ago? And she said, yes. And he said, well, I want you to know it's because of you that I resigned my job there. So I just share that story. You never know what small thing that we might do can have a consequence far beyond what we might even know about. So I hope those stories have been helpful for you, interesting. So I'd love to hear questions, comments.
Great, thank you, David. So folks, you can go ahead and use that reaction hand raising if you'd like to speak. There's also the chat, and there's already one question in there. I can start with that. But however you'd like to communicate your questions, we'll go for it here. So David, Nancy starts with she says, I have a very practical question. Having been arrested over 150 times, what was your process for getting bail and released and potentially being tried? Do you want to speak to that?
Well, I've never posted bail. I feel I'm probably more useful in jail than just giving them some money and getting out. But I've always done, every time I've been arrested, it's been with other people. And at least on the West Coast, there were 1,000 of us arrested in June of '62 at the Livermore Nuclear Weapons Labs. And instead of feeling sorry for ourselves, there was 500 men there was not enough room in the jail, in a circus tent with a barbed wire around the outside. And we just use that as an opportunity to build community, to sing, to share stories. Dan Ellsberg was there with us. He would do a briefing on, on the danger of nuclear war almost every day, et cetera. And at first they were giving us 2 to 4 weeks in jail. But after several years of that, they just gave up. They said, why should we give these people a free board and room, and a bed, so they can strengthen their movement. So luckily, I've only, the longest I've ever spent is 2 weeks in jail. And I think part of our strength is in numbers, but part of it is, financial on their part. The kind of stuff that we have done, some people did spend, I think, 2 or 3 months at Concord New Weapons Station. I had my arm broken when I refused to get off the tracks one time, but never had to spend more than a couple of weeks.
Thanks, David. Arnie has a sort of related question. He'd like for you to say something about the role of civil disobedience in a time of militarized policing and mass incarceration that disproportionately victimizes people of color.
I say that once again, please.
Sure. Can you say something about the role of civil disobedience in a time of militarized policing and mass incarceration that disproportionately victimizes people of color?
Well, I think I think that one of the tools of nonviolence is to withdraw our cooperation. And part of the cooperation that the government wants is to do nothing. That people, will listen to the propaganda or the government leaders that say, we're going to threaten nuclear war with Russia or China and just, get out of the way. Let us do it. And if people get in the way, as John Lewis, if you saw his film, I think it was called Getting in the Way. If enough people do that, on a sustained basis, they can't fight their wars. And I think there's strength in numbers. I think the police are much more likely to go after individual people, and especially people of color, one person at a time. But if there's, 20, 50, 100 people and who are committed to nonviolence, we're not going to, swear at the police or spit at them or, all that kind of stuff. That's part of our protection. It's not, I'm sure some of you know the book, Why Civil Resistance Works by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan. After studying 323 violent and nonviolent movements around the world, or massive change, a major change of governments, or they found the nonviolent movements more than twice as likely to be successful. So there's good reasons for movements to be nonviolent. Both, it's the right thing to do, but it's also the most effective. And I think the fact that the police, what we found, for instance, when in the South in the voting rights campaign back in the 65, I guess, when Black people day after day after day would go to try to register to vote, and they'd get, bring out the police dogs and the fire hoses and beat people up and say, get out of this. They were trying to register to vote. And this got shown on national TV, and people were responding totally nonviolently. And within several months, we had a voting rights campaign. Well, somehow we need to touch the conscience of the American people about, in the 60s, it was the Vietnam War, and it was racial segregation, et cetera. And there's many issues now. There's the climate, and there's the wars, and there's the racism and the police violence. But and I think one of the sad things is that some people have given up on nonviolence, and that, I'm afraid, just feeds into the racism of the police. And I think, anyway, I think a person of color, and I think a main part of our work in the movement is how to arouse the conscience of the nation and arouse the conscience of millions of people. And that it was done very successfully in the 60s. And I think by our nonviolent, keeping our eyes on the prize and marching toward, justice, and the police just, going crazy, beating up people, running over them with their horses, et cetera. So, and actually SLC chose Selma, Alabama, because they knew there was a very racist police chief there, and he would beat them up. Well, knowing that, they went there because that was the way to get to the American people. And it did. And it didn't mean there was no suffering. So it probably doesn't do justice, but that's, I'll try that.
That's okay. Thank you, David. That was important to hear. And I have another question for you. This one is Chris asking, where should we Americans be getting in the way today, specifically to hinder the US versus Russia proxy war in Ukraine?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the American people have been propagandized. Heavy duty. Every day you see the horrors of the war, what the Russians are doing, killing civilians and hospitals. And it's interesting, during the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan, you hardly ever saw that, because we were the good guys. We certainly wouldn't be doing that kind of stuff, but it was happening. And I mean, the truth is that all wars are horrible, and all wars. I mean, the World Beyond War has a T-shirt that says, "The first casualty of war is truth," and the rest are mostly civilians. And I mean, unfortunately, that's very, very true. So we cannot remain silent. And I think even the Progressive Caucus, after their letter to Biden saying, let's negotiate, they had to withdraw it because there was so much heavy-duty pressure from the rest of the Democratic establishment. Well, we have to give our Congress people the courage to do that. And So one of the things, we need to bombard Congress with letters. That's one thing. I don't know your Congress people from New Hampshire, what stance they're taking, but go to see them in person when they're home, at their home office. And so, I mean, I would encourage sitting in their office until they realize that the only way to really end this war is to negotiate and to listen to the concerns and needs of both sides. I mean, that's the only way it's really going to end. And what both sides are on a collision course right now, both sides say, we're going to fight till victory. Well, so one of the things is working on Congress. I mean, my wife and I are war tax resistors. 53% of all our federal tax dollars go for wars and preparations for wars and nuclear weapons. I mean, you've probably heard it said, or one of President Nixon's right-hand men said, when he looked out the window and saw 500,000 people marching in front of the White House, he said, let them march all they want to, as long as they pay their taxes. Well, they need young men, and they need the taxes of all the rest of us. If there are military bases or military or installations making even any parts of nuclear weapons or any of the weapons we're sending to Ukraine, develop a campaign where you are vigilating, blocking workers going in if you feel led to do that. There's a divest campaign where people are getting universities and colleges and church groups, et cetera, divesting any funds that are going into nuclear weapons. There's 5 or 6 major companies that are making hundreds of billions of dollars off these wars. So take away the money. Letters to the editor are a way to kind of break the silence. I mean, any way, I mean, if you're, I mean, you've got a good college, and at least one in New Hampshire, there should be teach-ins and encouraging the students to get actively involved. And, you know, where there are draft boards, or I guess we don't have draft boards, but where there are induction centers, you know, where they're recruiting young people to be willing to fight in these wars, you know, demonstrate, block the entrance, as happened during the Vietnam War. I mean, that's some of the ways that you can get in the way. But you can't remain silent. That's what they need. They'll keep on the war forever. And I think just this idea that to end this war, we're going to have to negotiate. More arms are not going to do it. More weapons. That's just going to get us deeper and deeper. And I don't know if you saw, but Zelensky apparently yesterday or today said, after he has the promise of tanks coming from the United States and Germany, massive tanks, he says, what we need is fighter jets. Well, if we want a nuclear war, you know, let's send the fighter jets. And, you know, it's madness. And Daniel Ellsberg said to me recently, he feels there's a 1 in 6 chance that we're going to have a full-scale nuclear war if we continue on this path. And we're on the same path with Cuba, with China. So it is truly madness. And so we have to speak out and we have to organize, etc. And I mean, personally, I don't think there's any reason in the world that could justify killing 9 billion people. And that's what a nuclear war is going to do, together with nuclear winter. So is there any reason in the world that could justify putting an end to life on our planet? I don't think so. But that's where we are, and the American people are remaining silent, by and large. Next.
Thank you, David. Let's see, I guess we have time for one more. Helen has a hand up. Helen, you
thank you.
in.
Okay, I just wanted to say that I think what probably would be effective is if we could find Ukrainians who oppose the war and then have them maybe speak on TV, speak at a conference, get attention, because the way it's being portrayed as the United States is saving the Ukrainians from Russia. Really, like the other examples that you gave, about, voting rights, the Vietnam War, there were people opposing these things or supporting them who people might not expect to take that position. But really, in this war with Ukraine, you never, ever, ever hear a Ukrainian person say that they don't want, they say they don't want the war, but they say they don't want the war because it'll stop if people help them even more, in quotes. And so I think somehow different people need to be found to speak.
Yeah.
That's it.
I mean, we don't hear very much about it in this country, in the press, but there are tens of thousands of Russians that have left Russia rather than fight in this war.
So then they should be found and given a voice.
Yeah, I mean, Biden at one point, I won't go into that, but and there's similar from Belarus. I mean, there's thousands that have left the country rather than go in the draft, and there's tens of thousands that have left Ukraine illegally, and all these places. There's been tremendous danger, and risking 2-5 years in prison. But these people need to be supported. And I don't know how many of you know Peace and Planet News, but it's put out by Veterans for Peace. If you just look up, you can find it on the internet. But it's excellent articles by vets and others, and it tells stories about these people that have left. But this is the kind of news that has to get out. And
right. No, I agree.
When all you see is Russia bombing hospitals and killing, old ladies, etc., we're going to have this, rah, let's have more war. I mean, what's the limit? We've decided to send tanks. We're, now considering sending fighter jets. Why not, just a small nuclear bomb? I mean, what is the end point? And is this? There is a pacifist movement in Ukraine. Yuri Shelizhenko is the president of it, but very, very courageous people, risking imprisonment or assassination or whatever, speaking out. And he's on the internet. He's on the board of World Beyond War. So you can find, and he actually has an article in this also. But we need to amplify those voices. And
Thank you.
we actually need, and it's partly from looking at history, is sending in $100 billion worth of weapons really going to get peace? Does it have any chance in the world of making peace? And I think probably most of you already know, Medea Benjamin has a book, by the way, called War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless War, that I very highly recommend. And it's really from, looking at both perspectives and trying to look, I mean, we say Russian invasion was unprovoked. Well, it was not unprovoked. But anyway, these alternative voices need to be heard. And once in a while, they do get on Democracy Now!, which I think is a much better place to get news than NPR or any of the commercial stations.
Great. Thank you, David. Listen, I'm going to need to wrap up, but I want you all who are here in the Zoom to know that David has agreed to stay a little longer and do more Q&A. So we're going to wrap up the official program, but if you want to ask more questions and talk more, please stay with us. But first, let me tell you a few things. Stay in touch with New Hampshire Peace Action at nhpeaceaction.org. and look us up on Facebook to learn more about what we're working on and what programming we have coming up. The next in our Monday Night Conversation series will be Whitney Howarth talking about building peace in our schools with restorative practices. That's on February 13th from 7 to 8 p.m. via Zoom. I also put in the chat links to where to find both our calendar and also our past programs on our YouTube channel. And this one will soon be up there too. This series is free and open to everyone. That said, it would mean a lot to us to have your support for the group and for this series in particular. So I'm going to put the donation, nhpeaceaction.org/donate. Even a small amount is a great help and boosts our spirit. And as I said, you can hang out a little longer, but first, let's just really thank David for tonight, for more than 60 years of this work, for writing this book. And we just really can't thank you enough. So let's let him see how much we appreciate him.
Thank you. So just two other really quick things. One, my book is also an audiobook now, which you can get free of charge. And I will send Amy the link to that. So you can send it out to everybody or get the book and share it with your children and grandchildren. The other, I would strongly encourage you to consider getting Medea Benjamin to come and give a talk. And or there's, if you don't do that, there's at least an 18-minute video that she's done kind of summarizing the whole perspective. That and I'll send Amy the link to that too. So you could, but you might want to use that.
Excellent, thank you. Will, I